If you want to get up and meet somebody in the back of the room or just turn to the person next to you, I'd like you to introduce yourself, describe what role that you play and that brought you here to this conference, and then something that we might not know just by looking at you. So something interesting about yourself that we might not guess just by looking at you, and then I'm going to ask you to introduce the partner that you got to know better. So I'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Just go wherever and introduce yourself. Well, thank you all for sharing. I encourage you throughout the weekend to get to know each other, meet new people. It's good for your brain, have new conversations. I have this up here. Peace is not found in the absence of chaos, rather in one's ability to create a calm space in the midst of it. Raise your hand if you've ever said something like this: as soon as this slows down, or as soon as I finish this project, I am going to ... And then raise your hand when that slows down or you finish that project, there's just this really calm space that you can embrace, or something else gets thrown into it. It's always that something else. Life doesn't quite wait for those calm spaces because it's always happening. And in order to create that, we really have to be intentional about it and mindful about it. It's a matter of making it happen, not waiting for it to happen. And when we're living in the midst of that, okay, as soon as this happens, or as soon as I have a break here, and we're not taking the break, then we're increasing our stress load over time, over and over and over again, to where we're less than functional in the midst of it. One of the things that I do with kids to show them the effects of, I need my glasses to read this, but it looks weird looking at you guys. One of the things that I do with kids to teach them what the brain's doing when we're stressed out, we will make these what I call peace jars, and basically it's just a water bottle with water, and we add glue to it to thicken the water, and then use glitter and beads to represent basically a snow globe. And so that's what we're making, and I'll often have them identify the stressors in their lives and pick maybe some beads that represent some big stressors and some glitter that represents some little stressors, and we'll fill the jar up and then shake it up. And much like a snow globe, the clarity of the water gets really cloudy. And so we'll try to look at each other through the glitter, which we call the stressors, and whenever we're stressed, our brain's so scattered that we cannot see beyond the stress. And so we'll sit together for a while and kind of just witness that. And it's a great representation of what goes on when we're stressed, because how many times we have so many thoughts going through our mind and racing through our mind, we can't form a complete thought, it's hard to remember anything, and it really feels all-consuming, like this is never gonna end. And so I will make those with kids and then encourage them when they are stressed to take that home and use it for a mindful breathing activity, where as they're focusing on maybe one bead that's floating at the surface, as they're watching that settle or the glitter settle, that they're doing some belly breathing, which is basically slow and deep breaths where your belly expands and contracts with your breath. And all they're doing is focusing on their breath and watching the glitter drop. And more often than not, whatever they're facing, the anger, the frustration, the fear, tends to settle with it. Because what we know about breathing is it lowers cortisol in our body. Cortisol is a stress hormone that creates inflammation. If you can think of any disease, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, they're all inflammatory in nature. And cortisol is a stress hormone that's elevated when we're stressed. So having some sort of activity that allows you or a child to come to a kind of calmer place in order to focus a bit better and clear our mind is imperative in order to just make life a bit easier. One of the, I was speaking to somebody earlier, Goldie Hawn is an actress. I'm sure a lot of you know who she is. And she developed the Hawn Foundation, or founded the Hawn Foundation. And what they do, they created this program, Mind Up. She worked with neuroscientists and a bunch of leads in the field of mindfulness. And her idea was, if we could teach kids about their brain, their emotions, what goes on in their brain when they're stressed, and ways to de-escalate that, what a different world we'd have. If you learn that at 5 instead of 65 when you're in crisis mode, life would be a whole lot better. And so what they do is they go into schools and they'll have a spit test, which elementary school students love to spit. And so in that spit, they'll test cortisol levels. So that's basically the pre-test. And after that, they will teach them about the brain, which I'll kind of do the basics with you today, what goes on with emotions, how to de-escalate them, and some mindful activities like mindful breathing, maybe something with a peace jar. And then the post-test is another spit test where they test cortisol levels. And 9.99 times out of 10, the entire school's cortisol drops just by teaching them about what goes on in the brain, what an emotion is, what it's trying to tell us, how to de-escalate it, and doing some basic breathing activities. So really important. Breathing's kind of on the basis of life, and it's something that can really reduce stress. This is just a quote I really like. A calm mind releases the most precious capacity a human being can have, the capacity to turn anger into compassion, fear into fearlessness, and hatred into love. A bit about the brain. You don't need to be a neuroscientist to really understand the brain. This is kind of an elementary, basic intro to Brain 101. Knowing these 3 parts can help reduce stress. The prefrontal cortex is right up here. It holds our executive functioning. It allows us to problem solve, think rationally, analyze a situation. The amygdala is basically the alarm center of our brain. It triggers our body into that fight, flight, or freeze response when we're faced with a threat. I like to compare it to a guard dog, and much like my own guard dog at home, will bark at anything coming down the driveway, whether it's a friend or foe, and won't stop until he's very sure of who you are. The amygdala works very much like that. It registers a perceived threat, not necessarily a real threat, and doesn't differentiate between a stressor and something that's life-threatening. And then the hippocampus is in charge of the storage and consolidation of memory. So in order for all of that to work really well and to be fully present and clear and alert, the amygdala has to be calm. We have to have this sense of safety and security. And then our prefrontal cortex is at full functioning level, and we can take in information and then send it to the hippocampus and store it into long-term memory. Now, if the amygdala is barking, basically, you can only imagine that the prefrontal cortex isn't working so well, and then it's certainly not, the data flow between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus isn't working that well either. And so it's really important to be able to self-regulate in order to think appropriately or most beneficially. Oftentimes, when we have a really strong emotion, we're doing or saying things that aren't quite effective. And we'll kind of step back from that in a calm space and go, why did I do that? Well, you did it because your prefrontal cortex wasn't quite functioning. It was clouded by the loud barking of the amygdala. And so just some basics that are important to know. The thing about the amygdala is if you are in a life-threatening situation, it's amazing because it can divert blood to large muscles to get you out of there, to allow you to freeze, which takes energy, or to fight a situation. It hones focus like razor sharp, and all of the energy is going to where it needs to go. The problem is if it's not life-threatening and it's just a stressor, then your brain is flooded and you're rendered useless. A prime example of the amygdala working in perfect order, I was driving on a 2-lane road with 2 really deep ditches on either side with my mother, and we were on our way to the emergency room for her. And so I'm driving down this road doing basically the speed limit and notice 2 cars coming at me, one oncoming and one in the lane that's supposed to be coming. And they were doing like 80, and I had about 2 seconds to decide what I was going to do. go into this ditch, which would crush my mother, or that ditch, who knows what would happen, I might not make it across the road, or go in the middle of the two cars coming down a very narrow 2-lane road. And I know that my prefrontal cortex was not working, but the amygdala sharpened my focus enough to just make a split-second decision. I ended up going in the middle of the lanes. The person that seemed more alert, I figured would move over, and I made it through, pulled over, and began shaking unbelievably. But had my prefrontal cortex been in charge of making that decision, I would have been dead, because I would have been analyzing it way too long. The amygdala just flooded blood to my brain, and I was able to handle that. And looking at, after I parked and was done freaking out, I thought, wow, that's really what's supposed to be happening. The cortisol was flooding, and so I was getting in this really cool, reflecting on the brain space. So when things like that happen, the amygdala and how it functions in that fight, flight, or freeze response is really important. But let's say I come to something that's stressor and not life-threatening, it often renders us not so functional. So the internal and external correlation. Oftentimes when we are internally stressed, scattered, angry, frustrated, anxious, the external world kind of mimics it. I mean, how many of you have experienced that? At least in our house, by Friday, my house, maybe not with all the Post-it notes, but my house is similar to that. By the time we get 2 kids and 2 careers off every day trying to get everybody where they're supposed to be, even if my week goes well and I'm really calm and regulated and grounded, by the time I get into my house and look at it, that'll cause stress. So oftentimes it's that internal and external correlation of chaos breeding chaos. And one of the things that's going on when we're stressed, we're often juggling 2 internal questions, both which really don't exist. One is what if, which is all about, I'm trying to get my stopwatch up here. The what ifs are all about the future. They're anxiety-based, fear-based. What if this doesn't happen? What if that doesn't happen? What if we end up getting divorced? What if my parent has to move and then I won't see them anymore? And then the big ticket one is, what if I die? So in our heads, we're often juggling the what if, and then the other one is the if only, which is past-centered. Already happened, can't rewrite it. If only I didn't say that. If only that didn't happen. So we have these 2 spaces that we live in our brain, none of which exists. The only thing that we know exists is the right here and right now, but we're often not present because we're worried about what if, which may or likely won't happen, or if only, which we don't have a whole lot of control over. And so that kind of breeds that chaos internally and externally. And then this is just so peaceful to look at, because peace breeds peace. When we're internally grounded and things feel safe and secure, then our external world tends to mimic it. And oftentimes, even in the midst of chaos, if we straighten up our external world, it tends to breed that peace internally, and they feed off each other. And when we're better able to find that peace in the midst of chaos, we can understand, it allows us to understand the brain basics of, what goes on and how we can reduce some of the stressors that we have, how we perceive and handle emotions in situations, and ways to self-regulate so that we can meet whatever needs that we have. And like I said at the beginning, when we were talking about finding that quiet space, it really has to be intentional. It doesn't just spontaneously happen. And so, this is kind of the typical pessimist and the optimist. Perception is everything. How we perceive our emotions has a big impact on how we handle stress and how we get our needs met. And then how we perceive what's going on in our body when we are stressed has a big impact on how much stress will increase or decrease. One of the stories that I like to explain to people who are coming in with issues around anxiety or panic attacks has to do with saber-toothed tigers, which that's rather frightening. But what happens is our body's response to a perceived or real stressor tends to cause us stress. I mean, how many people have like, oh, I just don't want to get anxious. I hate being anxious, so we get anxious about being anxious. Or I really don't want to be depressed because I hate being sad, and oh, I feel like it's going to happen, and now I'm getting depressed about being potentially depressed. So, like I said, the amygdala doesn't differentiate between a stressor and something that's life-threatening. So oftentimes, let's say I realize that the project I thought was due next month is due in 2 days. Obviously, that's going to build a little stress. And so I will immediately start feeling that stress, and what the amygdala registers is an oh no. When I say, oh no, it's due 2 days from now, the amygdala will go, saber-toothed tiger number 1. And it needs to prep my body to fight, flight, or freeze. And so my heart will start racing, and blood will start pumping to my large organs and my brain so that I don't bleed out, so that I can run away. You know, my thighs and biceps really want to get, you know, full blood flow so that I can face that. And so that increase in heart rate and breath rate is going to cause me to now go, you know, oh no, I can feel my heart race. So once again, I've got now 2 saber-toothed tigers. One, my presentation is due earlier than I thought, stressor not life-threatening, and now my heart's racing. And so I'm perceiving my heart racing as a threat, not something that my body's doing because it thinks it needs to do and hasn't registered that it's not life-threatening. So now my heart starts racing out even more because with 2 saber-toothed tigers, I need even more blood flow and more oxygen. And so then my heart rate increases, and now I'm getting sweaty, and my mouth's getting dry, and I might feel dizzy, and maybe I'm having a heart attack. And so now the amygdala registers saber-toothed tiger number 3. So in a matter of seconds, I went from, oh no, it's due 2 nights from now, to I'm probably having a heart attack and I need to go to the ER, which is a classic panic attack. It kind of spirals out of control in a matter of seconds. And it's all because of how I perceived my body in the response to the initial threat. And if we know that, okay, my body is doing what it thinks it needs to do, but you know, there isn't a saber-toothed tiger here, I just need to take a few breaths and kind of problem solve. I'll either be pulling an all-nighter or maybe I can get some extension. It's not the end of the world. So if we're able to look at what our body's doing differently, then we can think about what we need and how to get that need met more effectively, and maybe avoid an ER visit. Anybody ever experienced that? Like immediate, oh no, and then it just quickly escalated to the point of, I'm probably gonna die soon? The other thing that has to do with perception has to do with how we perceive emotions. I want you to read the 2 columns of emotions, and without thinking too much, label them. Put a label on the left side and a label on the right side. And somebody share what labels you put on those emotions. Go ahead.
I believe the left side is positive emotions and the right side is negative emotions.
Yep. Did anybody have anything different? No, basically it's either good, bad, positive, or negative, right? And those are our typical perceptions of emotions. Well, guess what the amygdala does when we label an emotion bad? It decides that it's a threat. And so the barking goes on. And the reality is that emotions are neither good nor bad. They're all effective. They all cue us into a need. You know, joy and happiness, it tells us that we're feeling safe and happy and secure, and we need more of that. Anger basically tells us something needs to stop, start, or change. Think about a time you've been angry, and you can probably relate to the fact that whatever was going on needed to stop, start, or change. Grief basically tells us that we've lost something we love, that we were deeply connected to. We don't grieve things we don't feel deeply connected to. Depression. Well, basically when we are faced with a challenge that we try to have power over or influence over and keep trying to come at it from this angle, and this angle, and it's not working, our mind and our body get exhausted. And so what it does, it retreats and withdraws and reserves energy. That's why often in the midst of depression, things kind of slow down. Feels like you're trucking through mud. It's self-protective. So it's a great emotion. It cues us into the fact that you need a break. And when we're able to recognize that instead of fear it, we can nurture ourselves in that break so that we can refuel and regroup. Anxiety tells us there's a perceived threat, to be alert. How many of you have entered parenthood for the first time and felt like you needed to watch the baby breathe to make sure that they were still breathing? Parental anxiety, while it gets us in trouble sometime, is really protective. So there really isn't an emotion that's good or bad. They all are just cues and messages to teach us to hone into what we need. And when we're less threatened by them and can really think about them, then we're more likely to get our needs met. But unfortunately, they're often pathologized. Generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder. And more often than not, I find that they're normal emotional reactions to abnormal circumstances. Another poem, I like poetry, as you can see, or quotes. This one is by Rumi, who's a 13th century Persian poet. If you've ever read any of his works, he is way ahead of his times as far as mindfulness, because the entire poem talks about basically not labeling emotions, not shutting them out, looking at them as protective factors that allow us to get our needs met. This being humans, a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they are a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. Oftentimes in life, we have triple bolted our doors against feeling these things. And when we do that, we deny ourselves, one, a connection with what's going on in our lives and the ability to meet our needs. This particular poem came at a very opportune time in my life. I was at a mindfulness workshop a number of years ago. My mother had just passed away after 4 years of caring for her, and my kids were very young. So not only was I grieving, but I was literally physically exhausted. And if any of you have lost somebody very close to you, you know that type of grief isn't just an emotion, you feel it in your body. And I had worked in therapy for a while, so I had worked with a lot of people through grief and various other things, and I had all of these ideas of how to process that and integrate it and move through it, but none of that applied to me. I wanted to get out of that emotion as fast as possible. I couldn't stand it, and I did everything I could to distract myself from it, which, by the way, is not effective. And so I was at this workshop, and the presenter had shared this poem, which resonated with me. I'm like, all right, I'm just gonna be this way for however long I need to be this way, and I'm going to turn towards it instead of away from it. And I thought back of, where did I find the most joy in life, aside from my kids and family? And it was really when I was in my teens and early 20s, I loved sailing. And so I decided that part of my therapy would be reconnecting with sailing, and I bought this 1978 small sailboat that needed to be gutted, because when I'm dealing with strong emotions, I like to physically do something. So I spent about 6 months gutting this sailboat and just sitting down and either working through the sailboat or working through my grief. And at the end of it, when I finally just surrendered to the fact of this is where I am at this point in my life, and it will pass like all emotions do, good or bad ones, it was extremely freeing. And I ended up naming that particular boat the Guest House, which now I go on it, and it's a great, peaceful place, and we enjoy it as a family. You know, one of the things that I had written, when we're no longer fearing or judging our emotions, we have a greater tolerance to be present with them. And they're more likely to just move through our lives like clouds or soft waves. Instead of, you know, how many of you lived through Tropical Storm Faye? It was in 2008. Raise your hand if you, I mean, our house, we canoed around our house. And what happened was the storm just sat on top of us and rained for 3 days straight. And when we are trying to lock the doors to emotions and avoid them and not feel them, it is like struggling in quicksand. You're only going to go deeper. And when you surrender to that, it really does move much quicker and more effectively. You move much quicker and more effectively through the process. So I noticed there were a lot of attorneys in the audience. And you know, when we think about perception, oftentimes how we approach something has a big impact on how we respond to it. And there's two ways to view our thoughts, emotions, or sensations in our bodies or the environment around us. We can come at it from the scientist perspective or the judge. The scientist basically kind of looks at things as interesting. I mean, look at his face, like, wow, that's amazing, how interesting. And the judges all have these frowny faces of, you know, a 7.5 or 6 isn't so good. So our society looks at things from a very moralistic standpoint. Things are often viewed as good or bad, right or wrong, correct or incorrect. And so attorneys and judges may be a little more locked into that frame of mind. So I encourage you all to shift into the scientist perspective. It has great benefits on how our brain functions and how we respond to threats. So the scientist says, wow, that's interesting. You know, let's gather more information, which triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. That's kind of the rest and repair part of our central nervous system. It tells us that we're safe, it lowers cortisol, sends in happy hormones and neurotransmitters. It increases our access to the prefrontal cortex. We can think more clearly when we're coming from the scientist perspective. It increases memory consolidation and recall, because if the prefrontal cortex is working, so is the hippocampus. The judge, however, looks at things as good or bad, right or wrong, punish or reward, which triggers this sympathetic nervous system. The amygdala registers something bad as a threat. And so that decreases our executive functioning and then decreases our ability to recall information. Oftentimes when I'm working with people with high trauma loads, they will say, you know, I really don't recall a whole lot of that part of my life. And if you think about how the brain works, if the amygdala is in survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze, and the prefrontal cortex isn't working that great and it's not storing memories, that's often why. You're living in a stress response in the brain. And so because we don't really like feeling strong emotions, most of us get anxious, like I said, about feeling anxious, or sad about feeling sad, and depressed about feeling depressed, or furious about feeling angry, and we'll go to great lengths to avoid these emotions. We'll get stuck in the reaction and the initial physiological response, the heart racing, the tense muscles, and we'll seek to avoid it at all cost. The problem is, as humans, we don't have very functional ways of avoiding those emotions. Oftentimes, it leads to substance abuse, affairs, excessive hours at the office, you know, addictions to Facebook and other social media apps, Netflix binges, gambling, food, and sex addictions, and shopping are just a few of the ways we humans tend to like to check out and tune out and avoid emotions. Which the cost of tuning out are pretty great. Our body keeps score. When we experience stress, we have, and that doesn't get regulated, we have increased health issues. There's a great documentary, All the Rage, that I recently watched, and it followed one doctor's approach to medicine, which basically taught people how to recognize what their emotions were. He was more of a mental health practitioner than a doctor. He's like, the only script I write is go get good with your emotions. Because, when we are stressed over time, we'll come up with all sorts of health issues. Relational distress and loneliness tends to increase. We have lower productivity when we're tuning out. It has negative impacts on sleep, concentration, memory, weight, pain, you name it. And whatever symptoms we may be feeling, just put a highlighter over them when we're trying to tune out, because what we do to avoid them causes more problems. And then there's certainly an increased risk of addiction and death. So what we want to do is tune in. The tuning out, I just thought that was funny. Tuning out doesn't work. If you haven't figured that out, I attempted that. It didn't work. And so tuning in. Certainly, if we understand the brain better and are less threatened by what our body is doing, we're more likely to tune in. A lot of times, people will say, well, I've tried mindfulness and meditation, and I just can't sit in a space, and I just get too anxious, or too many thoughts are going through my head. And they don't want to feel that, so they avoid it. A lot of mindfulness is about just being present with whatever's coming your way. So like I had mentioned about emotions, they aren't good or bad. Emotions actually save lives. They create positive change. They help us recharge. They allow us to love and be loved. When we're able to identify the emotion, key point is we can identify what we need. And if we're regulated, not only can we identify what we need, we can seek to get it met in really healthy ways. Certainly anxiety and fear help keep us safe and alert to danger and perceived threats, and depression allows our bodies and minds to reserve and recharge our energy. The pathologizing emotions, certainly there are some instances where it is helpful to diagnose and treat based on a diagnosis, but a lot of times, like I said, it has to do with normal human emotional responses to abnormal situations and excessive stress loads. If we think about it, how many of you have experienced the death of a loved one, been divorced, moved from a place you loved, and tried incessantly to fix a relationship to no avail and not felt depressed or sad? It's a normal human emotion. The same goes for anyone who's felt marginalized or oppressed or abused. Typically, anger is an emotion that goes with that. And so being able to tune into them allows us to channel that and then do something to meet that need effectively. And then these are just some other benefits, some of which I went over. Allowing ourselves to meet that underlying need that I spoke about, and certainly tuning in as an observer and a scientist reduces that physiological response. Around the holidays, I get an influx of people who come in for therapy because the holidays require us to go back to our family of origin. That's a huge stressor for a lot of people. And they talk about, as soon as I go back to mom or dad's or my brothers or sisters, I quickly get swooped up into that tornado. And before I know it, I'm that 16-year-old sister who's fighting with her sister about who mom likes best. And so a fun activity that I'll give people is, how about this year go in as if you're a scientist or a journalist documenting an unknown tribe. All you're doing is taking information. You're kind of 3 steps removed, and you're the observer. Try to determine what each other's roles are, give them labels, document the rules, the spoken and unspoken rules, and just keep notes of it. Journalists don't get tied into, the emotion of it, they're just documenting. And so they'll often come back feeling a whole lot better with a lot of fuel for a great storyline. They identify, oh yeah, that's the victim in our family, and I tend to get swooped up into this pattern of blame games with so-and-so. And that ability to take a few steps back and be the observer and scientist renders us far more effective. When we're tuning in, we're better able to respond effectively to stressors rather than react impulsively. If I'm acting out of anger, I'm saying something or doing something far less effective. Rather than, I'm really feeling angry about something, what's going on, what do I need, let me calm down, and then approach it from a more regulated state. Sorry about that. We can when we're able to tune into an emotion, we can thank the emotion for the information and then give it permission to retire. If I'm angry, I can say, all right, thanks for the info. I don't need to live in that. You can go take a break, and I've got it from here. I'm capable and competent to take it over. So, mindfulness defined. When we're able to be more comfortable with what our body and brain and emotions are doing, mindfulness is a whole lot easier. We're able to sit more still with whatever is going on. And all of these are different ways of defining mindfulness, but basically it's just this intentional state of non-judgmental mind-body awareness in the here and now. As we're having a thought or a body sensation, we're not judging it good or bad, we're just taking note of it and then coming back to some centered place. One of the authors that I really like reading on mindfulness is Jon Kabat-Zinn, and he wrote this book in Full Catastrophe Living. He did some work at Mass General, a big hospital in Boston, and he was working with chronic pain, PTSD, and anxiety and depressive disorders. And he found that the patients who were not getting great benefits from medication, who entered the mindfulness program, had great relief from those symptoms. And one of the ways that he described the distinction between a stress reaction and a stress response really resonated with me. He writes, stress reactions are generally fueled by unconscious habitual patterns, often learned from past challenges and experiences. Examples usually include maladaptive coping techniques such as smoking, addiction, general busyness avoidance, and in the long run lead to mental and physical breakdown. When we are stressed out, we are very quick to go back to old patterns that are comfortable, that maybe we learned in our family of origin. And usually those aren't that great. However, a stress response instead of a stress reaction involves acknowledging the emotion rather than trying to suppress it, while developing tools to work with that emotion instead of against it. So ideally, mindfulness allows us to increase those skills of being able to respond instead of react. There's lots of benefits to mindfulness. One is that lowered cortisol, that stress hormone in our body. It also has positive effects on the structure and neural patterns of the brain. When we're looking at brain scans of people who practice mindfulness, they have you would think that the brain would be very calm and mellow. It's actually heightened, but it's heightened in all of the right areas, not the threat response areas, so that they're really alert. Another benefit would be increased attention and cognitive flexibility. It impacts our ability to decrease symptoms of depression, anxiety, chronic pain, and other stress-related disorders. We often have improved self-regulation, social relationships, and academic performance improves. In my work with couples therapy, the Gottmans have been studying couples for the past 35 years. And what they found in that research was the couples who were most successful came to the table more self-regulated. So couples who reported higher relational satisfaction, when they were coming to the table to discuss maybe a hot topic, their bodies were physiologically more regulated. And then certainly another benefit would be improved self-awareness and a greater ability to just get your needs met in healthy ways. So some strategies for living mindfully and for brain health, like I said at the beginning, breathe. When we are stressed, we are taking shallow breaths, often in our chest. They're not those deep belly breaths. And if you want to know how to breathe, watch a baby. Babies instinctually know how to breathe. We lose that skill as we get older and stress sets in. Babies will be on their back in a crib and their belly's rising slowly, and and as they inhale, their belly's rising, and as they exhale, it's contracting. Sleep and rest, it makes sense. Anybody ever been sleep deprived and tried to function, or had a baby for, yeah, there's somebody. So sleep is imperative to well-being. Nutrition, obviously what we put in our body is what we get out. And when we are depressed and stressed, we often go to foods that are quick and easy to eat. They have a high carb load, and they give us a quick spike of energy, like coffee or cereal or donuts. I ate a few Krispy Kremes myself yesterday, but we often come crashing down. And so having nutritious foods that come from nature that help us to have the energy and attention that we need, but sustained, allow us to live, with more brain health and physical health overall. Unplug, that's a big one. The research coming out of the effects of media are not, is pretty apparent that unplugging is a necessity. Take moments to just put your phone outside of your bedroom. Don't go to sleep with the phone dinging where you're at. Nature is a great place to unplug. If you're going to unplug from media, plug into nature. Gardening, taking walks. The thing about nature is it heightens our brain and stimulates it in ways that being indoors does not. The other part, certainly wake, eat, walk, and listen mindfully. When I'm working with kids or adults, mindful breathing's kind of the beginning of some of the mindful strategies. But when you wake up, rather than, jolting out of bed and rushing to get your clothes and starting the day late, just stay in that space and take a few breaths and greet the day. Be more present with just waking up and not thinking 10 steps ahead. When you're eating, actually eat and be present and pay attention to the food. When I was teaching, I would have that 30-minute lunch where I had to drop kids off, get back, so I really only had about 10 minutes to eat. And I was often eating, grading papers, and everything else. I couldn't tell you what I ate, and I learned how to eat really quickly and just get food in so I'm not starving. And so one of the first workshops that I did on mindfulness started with a mindful eating activity. And I was teaching at the time, I couldn't tell you what I ate for 5 years at that point because I never paid attention to what I ate. I just ate to sustain myself. And I walked in, rushed, my head's in a bunch of different places. I've got this, and this to do after this conference, and maybe I'll grade some papers while I'm there. And there were a box of raisins, so I snuck in kind of a few minutes after it started, and I'm like, great, I forgot to eat. So I dumped the box of raisins in my hand, popped the whole thing in my mouth, and then, sat there as I noticed the presenter was like, and now we're going to do a mindful eating activity. You'll notice there's a box of raisins in front of you. And I'm like, great. And so I was like kind of doing this. She quietly brought me over the box of raisins, and she's like, I'd like you to look at the box, notice where it came from, and recognize that people worked to put these boxes together before the raisins even entered them. And now I'd like you to take out one raisin. Look at the raisin, its color, its texture. And I'm like, wow, I've never, ever eaten like this. And so one raisin, think about what it would taste like before you even put it into your mouth. And so this went on for a couple of minutes, and then we placed it in our mouth, but we didn't chew. We just rolled it around on our tongue and figured out what it tastes like at different parts of our tongue. And then we took one bite. and then another bite, and then another bite. And this is one raisin. I don't think I chewed 15 raisins more than twice before I swallowed them prior to this activity. And so finally we swallowed the raisin and did it again with another raisin. And I, as you can see, never forgot that meal. I shifted into being fully present with what I was doing, and the raisins tasted better in that moment than I had ever tasted before. And so whatever we're doing, whether we're waking, we're eating, we're walking, or listening, do it mindfully. You know, sometimes I will sit with my kids and we'll have a mindful listening moment where we just close our eyes in the backyard and tune into whatever we can hear going on around us. And, you know, oftentimes the birds are much louder. We can hear planes going by, or in the best case scenario, we can hear each other breathe. And we cannot do that when we're in, what do I need to do after this? And what do I need to do after this? And this needs to happen. And oh no, I forgot that. So learning how to train your brain to just be fully present with whatever you're doing allows you to just live more fully and have greater memories. So when you're eating dinner tonight, I encourage you to take about 3 hours to eat that. Think about who prepared it. Certainly, living mindfully allows us to practice compassion for ourselves and for others. When we're no longer judging our own emotions, we can embrace them and take care of ourselves and nurture ourselves, and we're less judgmental about others. We have more compassion for them. I did a workshop with Elijah Goldstein. He's written some great books on mindfulness. And one of our lunch break activities was to have a mindful walking activity. We were in DC a few years ago at the time. And as you're walking for your lunch break, you were asked to just kind of have this mantra in your head as you pass people on the street and say, just like me. So as I'm passing people on the streets of DC, I was making eye contact, and usually when I'm walking as a woman in a city by myself, my head's down and I'm kind of going where I need to go. And so I kind of, it just expanded my body posture and looked up, and DC is a really diverse, amazing city, and it was such a great experience. I felt so much more alive and connected to the people I was with, and that just like me, really allowed me to feel more connected with the people around me. So what else do we have? Laugh and play. There's nothing better than joy and laughter and playfulness. It's great for our brain, and it allows us to be really present. Kids are great teachers of that. Do things that you love. Do something new. Doing new things creates new neural pathways in our brain. And we used to think that as we age, our brain just perpetually deteriorates, but now we know it has plasticity and can continue to build new neural pathways throughout our lifespan. So, doing something new allows us to tap into that resource, whether we just decide to brush our teeth with our left hand instead of our right, or take up ballroom dancing, or do something else new. It all helps to build new neural pathways. Pause before actions. How many of you get a phone call or a text and immediately go to it? Pausing before actions allows us to ground ourselves. Before we open the door to our home after coming home from work, I'll encourage you to just pause and take a few breaths and transition from whatever you were doing into where you're going. Before you pick up the phone, it can ring a few times, they'll call back, they'll leave a message, you'll certainly get more texts and emails, but take a few breaths before you go into that. Or better yet, if you have a strong emotion, hold your tongue. If you can pause in the midst of that, you're more likely to walk away doing something far more effective. And then connect with your senses, which nature is a great place to do that. It's sensory overload in the best way possible. And one activity that I'll often do with adults and children is kind of this 5 senses check-in. Kind of right here, right now, I can feel, my feet on the floor. I can hear whatever's around me. I can see, this. And, you're just checking into, in this moment, what are my senses taking in? Meditate daily. all that takes is a 30-second breath activity, which you can do in the car, or, I can do it right now while I'm speaking to you. Everybody has time to do something where you're just getting present within your body. And then hang out with healthy brains. When we connect with people that lift us up, their energy influences ours and ours influences them. So, seek out other people who are living mindfully and connect with them. So now we're just going to do a quick little mindful activity that hopefully you can implement in your daily life. And it's brief. It allows you to kind of check in and be present, when you're feeling overwhelmed or stress is coming up. And it's an acronym. The Elijah Goldstein workshop I was at, he did this activity with us. And, I like quick little catchy acronyms because they're easy to remember. And basically what you do is stop. Stop whatever you're doing. Put your pen down, ground yourself wherever you're at, feel the chair beneath or behind you, and just stop. Take a breath or two, feel the oxygen coming in and feel your whole body breathing. Slow down your breath. And at that moment, you want to observe. You want to observe your thoughts, what's going through your mind. Are the thoughts helpful or judgmental? You want to observe the sensations in your body and the emotions that you have. What are you feeling right now? Joy, contentment, a little anxiety, stress, and where are you holding it in your body? Do you feel tense in the neck or relaxed? Are your shoulders back? Is your face soft or kind of tense jaw? And then once you take note of all that, once again without judgment, you just want to proceed with that new information you have. Just like a scientist does. It takes in information and then creates a plan to adapt to it. So we want to proceed with compassion. If I'm feeling a bit of anxiety, then I want to take a few more breaths. And if I recognize that I'm holding tension in my neck, one way to proceed with compassion would be to kind of stretch my neck. And then kind of just transition into whatever you were doing. And that takes, 10, 30 seconds at most. And it allows you to kind of regroup and de-escalate stressors. The thing with stress is, if we wake up, let's say the alarm goes off and, oh my, I'm already late. And then I've got this meeting and that didn't go well, and then something else, and I got to pick the kids up for this. Stress is going like this throughout the day. And then let's say we barely get any sleep, so we're starting the next day off a little higher and stress keeps going. And our body keeps score, it holds that. If we're doing some activity throughout the day like this, like a stop activity, or taking 5-minute or 5-second breaks to take a breath, life still goes on and we're still going to be stressed. But what happens is the alarm went off, but I took a few grounding breaths, so my stress levels went down. And then something else happened, but then I took a few grounding breaths and my stress levels went down. And so instead of ending the day up here, we're probably here in a lower, more regulated state. So as always, there's an app for that. And here are some great apps that you can get on your phone to help with mindfulness. They all have guided meditations that you can do. If anybody's having trouble sleeping or feeling anxious, some guided meditations really help to kind of quiet your mind and guide it. Because, when we're dealing with that what if only scatterbrained, it's hard to learn how to do that for ourselves. The Calm app has this circle space that kind of expands to teach you how to guide your breath. And I have a son who's not too fond of flying. And so whenever we're on takeoff, we have the Calm app up, which has that breath circle, and he's really focused on matching his belly breathing to the circle expanding or contracting. And before you know it, we're in the air and all's well. So it's a good way to teach him and anybody else to de-escalate stress. If I have time, what's my time look like? When does this end? 2:15? Oh. I would encourage you, I'm assuming a lot of you work with children. Becky Bailey has written some books on conscious discipline, and she has great little handouts to teach kids some mindful activities. One of them is STAR, and it's this big happy looking star. It's kind of like the acronym STOP, and it stands for smile, take a deep breath, and relax. We know when we smile, it triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's a good quick activity to teach to kids, and you can send them home with the little star picture. There's also faucet, where the kids act like they're a faucet that's closed, take a deep breath in and shh, let the water out. That sound that we make when we make the faucet sound, our tongue pressing on the roof of our mouth often also triggers the parasympathetic nervous system. And then she has a balloon one with the picture of a balloon. It's another activity to kind of ground them. And then there's a pretzel one where I encourage you to try and do it. It's not that easy. You're twisting your arms and your legs and you're in a posture with your tongue on your mouth. But that sensory-wise deeply triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, which, is the rest and repair signal to our brain. So, and then the last slide is resources. And I think all of the PowerPoints for this presentation and all the other ones are somewhere on an app. So you didn't have to write everything down, but the conference, I believe, has all of those. And if anybody would like more information or this, if you're not able to get it from wherever they have it, I'd be happy to email it to you. So I think we have 30 seconds. Does anybody have a question? No? All right, well, thanks for coming. Have a good day.